Why do encounters with strangers so often go wrong? And how have these misunderstandings shaped our world in ways we never imagined? You can purchase Malcolm Gladwell's thought-provoking book, Talking to Strangers, through the link in the video description below. Now, let's explore the fascinating and sometimes troubling ways we misread people we don't know. The Sandra Bland case, a modern tragedy. Malcolm Gladwell begins his exploration with the tragic case of Sandra Bland, a 28-year-old African-American woman who was pulled over by Texas State Trooper Brian Encinia in July 2015 for a minor traffic violation. What should have been a routine encounter escalated rapidly into a heated confrontation. 3 days after her arrest, Bland was found dead in her jail cell, having taken her own life. This case serves as the backbone for Gladwell's entire book. He returns to it repeatedly, using it as a lens through which to examine why interactions between strangers can go so catastrophically wrong. The dashcam video of the encounter reveals a fundamental problem in human interaction: the misreading of strangers. What happened between Bland and Encinia wasn't simply about racial bias or police misconduct, though these factors certainly played a role. At its core, it was about two strangers who completely misunderstood each other's intentions, behaviors, and emotional states. This fundamental misunderstanding is not unique to this case, but represents a pattern that repeats throughout human history with sometimes devastating consequences. Gladwell argues that we have a default assumption that we can easily understand people we don't know based on limited information. This assumption is not only wrong but dangerous. The tools we rely on to make sense of strangers are flawed, leading to miscommunication, conflict, and occasionally, tragedy. Truth default theory: why we trust. One of our biggest mistakes when dealing with strangers is what psychologist Tim Levine calls truth default theory. We naturally assume people are telling the truth unless we have clear evidence to the contrary. This default to truth isn't a character flaw but a necessary social adaptation. Society couldn't function if we constantly questioned everyone's honesty. Gladwell illustrates this concept through the case of Ana Montes, a Cuban spy who worked undetected at the Defense Intelligence Agency for 17 years, despite numerous red flags that should have revealed her deception. Her colleagues and supervisors defaulted to believing she was trustworthy, ignoring inconsistencies in her behavior and background. Similarly, he examines how Bernie Madoff maintained his massive Ponzi scheme for decades despite financial experts examining his records. These weren't cases of negligence or incompetence, but examples of our natural human tendency to default to truth. We're designed to give people the benefit of the doubt. This default to truth serves us well in most situations. The overwhelming majority of our interactions involve honest communication, and constantly suspecting others would make society impossible. However, this same tendency leaves us vulnerable to those rare individuals who are skilled at deception. Gladwell argues that we shouldn't try to become more suspicious. Instead, we should recognize that occasional deception is the price we pay for a functioning society built on trust. The alternative, constant suspicion, would be far worse, creating a world where cooperation and social cohesion would break down. However, this natural tendency to trust creates significant blind spots when interacting with strangers. When someone doesn't fit our expectations or preconceptions, we often fail to recognize it because we're defaulting to what we believe is true rather than carefully evaluating the evidence before us. The illusion of transparency. Another fundamental error we make when interacting with strangers is assuming that people's inner emotions and intentions are transparent and can be easily read through facial expressions and behavior. Gladwell calls this the illusion of transparency. To illustrate this point, Gladwell examines the famous case of Neville Chamberlain's meetings with Adolf Hitler before World War II. Chamberlain believed he could assess Hitler's intentions by meeting him face to face. After their encounters, Chamberlain was convinced Hitler was sincere in his desire for peace. He famously returned to Britain declaring peace for our time, just months before Hitler invaded Poland, triggering World War II. This wasn't simply naivety on Chamberlain's part. He fell victim to the widespread belief that we can accurately judge character and intentions through personal interaction. He trusted his ability to read Hitler's expressions, tone, and demeanor as indicators of his true intentions. Modern psychological research shows this confidence is misplaced. Across numerous studies, people perform barely better than random chance when trying to detect lies based on behavioral cues. Even professionals trained in deception detection, judges, police officers, intelligence agents, perform only marginally better than untrained individuals. Our expressions and behaviors don't transparently reveal our internal states. Cultural differences further complicate this. What constitutes normal eye contact, facial expressions, or conversational style varies dramatically across cultures, creating additional opportunities for misreading strangers from different backgrounds. The illusion of transparency creates a dangerous overconfidence in our ability to judge others. We believe we can spot liars, understand intentions, and read emotions accurately when in reality, we're often projecting our expectations onto ambiguous signals. This overconfidence leads to snap judgments about strangers that can have serious consequences when we're wrong. Mismatched and coupled behaviors. Complicating matters further is what Gladwell calls mismatched behaviors. Some people naturally present in ways that don't match our expectations of how someone feeling a particular emotion should behave. Their outer expression doesn't match their inner state in the way we expect. Gladwell examines the case of Amanda Knox, an American student who was wrongfully convicted of murdering her roommate in Italy. Knox's behavior after the murder, kissing her boyfriend, doing cartwheels in the police station, appearing cold and unemotional, didn't match how Italian investigators expected a grieving, innocent person to act. Her mismatched behavior was interpreted as evidence of guilt. Similar mismatches happen in everyday interactions. Some people naturally smile when nervous or uncomfortable. Others maintain a flat affect when deeply moved. Some cultures encourage emotional restraint in situations where others expect visible distress. These mismatches create fertile ground for misunderstanding. The problem is compounded by what psychologists call coupling, the relationship between behaviors and their context. We often fail to recognize how strongly behavior is coupled to specific environments and situations. Gladwell argues that many behaviors and decisions cannot be understood when separated from their context. For example, suicide methods are strongly coupled to availability and context. When the United Kingdom switched from coal gas, which contained carbon monoxide, to natural gas in home heating systems during the 1960s and 1970s, the overall suicide rate dropped dramatically. People who might have used the oven to commit suicide when it was a convenient option didn't simply switch to other methods. Many didn't attempt suicide at all. The behavior was tightly coupled to the specific opportunity. Similarly, crime is often coupled to very specific locations and conditions. A small number of city blocks may account for the majority of certain crimes in a city. Individual police officers may have dramatically different arrest rates depending on where and when they patrol, not because of personal bias, but because of these environmental couplings. When we fail to recognize these context-specific patterns, we misattribute behaviors to personality, character, or intention, rather than seeing how strongly they're tied to particular situations. This leads to fundamental misunderstandings about why strangers act the way they do. Alcohol and myopia. Gladwell devotes significant attention to how alcohol affects interactions between strangers, particularly in the context of sexual assault cases on college campuses. He introduces the concept of myopia, or alcohol-induced short-sightedness, which deeply impairs our ability to interpret complex social cues. Alcohol doesn't just lower inhibitions. It creates a form of tunnel vision where immediate influences dominate while long-term considerations fade from view. Intoxicated people become hyperresponsive to their immediate environment while losing the ability to consider future consequences or abstract principles like consent. This myopia makes alcohol particularly dangerous in ambiguous social situations where reading subtle cues is essential. 2. Intoxicated strangers interact with impaired judgment, misread signals, and focus only on immediate gratification rather than potential consequences. This creates perfect conditions for misunderstanding and potential harm. Gladwell examines several high-profile campus sexual assault cases where both parties were intoxicated, leading to radically different interpretations of what consent meant and whether it was given. These cases highlight the challenges in determining truth when memories are impaired and perceptions were compromised during the interaction itself. Rather than focusing only on individual responsibility, Gladwell suggests we need to recognize how certain environments and contexts enable these problematic encounters. The coupling between alcohol, unsupervised social environments, and sexual misconduct is powerful. Addressing the contextual factors might be more effective than focusing exclusively on individual behavior. This perspective invites us to think about how institutional structures and environmental factors contribute to misunderstandings between strangers. By recognizing these systemic patterns, we might design better approaches to preventing harmful interactions. Enhanced interrogation and torture. In one of the book's most disturbing sections, Gladwell examines how misreading strangers contributed to the use of torture by American intelligence agencies after 9/11. The case of al-Qaeda operative Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM, serves as his primary example. When KSM was captured in 2003, CIA interrogators were convinced he was withholding crucial information about imminent terrorist attacks. They subjected him to enhanced interrogation techniques, including waterboarding him 183 times. KSM eventually provided extensive information, much of which turned out to be false. The interrogators misread KSM's resistance as evidence he was hiding something valuable, when in reality, he was simply an extraordinarily resistant individual regardless of what information he possessed. They misinterpreted his behavior based on their own expectations, rather than understanding his actual psychological makeup. This misreading extended to the broader assumption that torture produces reliable information. Research consistently shows that extreme stress impairs memory and encourages people to say whatever they think will end their suffering, regardless of its truth. Yet the illusion of transparency led interrogators to believe they could distinguish between genuine and false confessions. Gladwell connects this to the concept of default to truth. Intelligence officials wanted so badly to believe they were getting valuable information that they accepted KSM's false statements when they aligned with their expectations. Their desire for the torture to be justified created a dangerous confirmation bias. This section powerfully illustrates how misreading strangers can have consequences that extend far beyond individual interactions, shaping national policy and affecting thousands of lives. When we misinterpret resistance, compliance, or confession from strangers in high-stakes situations, the results can be catastrophic. The case of Sylvia Plath and the suicide paradox. Gladwell explores how misreading strangers affects our understanding of suicide through the case of poet Sylvia Plath, who took her life in 1963. Her death has often been portrayed as inevitable given her long history of depression and previous suicide attempts. However, Gladwell argues this perspective fundamentally misreads who Plath was and the nature of suicide itself. He introduces research showing that suicidal behavior is often impulsive rather than planned, coupled to specific methods and circumstances, and frequently occurs without clear warning signs. Plath died by carbon monoxide poisoning using her gas oven. She had carefully sealed the kitchen to protect her children sleeping upstairs and left them milk and bread. These actions have been interpreted as evidence of determined planning. However, Gladwell notes that Plath had also scheduled an appointment with her doctor for the following day and left a note asking him to call, suggesting ambivalence rather than absolute determination. The suicide paradox is that we typically look for explanations in personality, psychology, and past behavior, yet research shows suicide is often situation-specific and impulsive. Many people who survive serious suicide attempts report deciding to act less than an hour before doing so. When lethal means are made less accessible, suicide rates often drop without corresponding increases in other methods. Gladwell challenges our tendency to create coherent narratives about strangers' actions. We retroactively construct stories that make suicide seem inevitable and comprehensible, when the reality is far more complex and coupled to specific circumstances. This misreading prevents us from developing more effective prevention strategies. The Sylvia Plath case illustrates how we impose narrative coherence on strangers' behavior after the fact, creating an illusion that we understand their actions when we may be completely misinterpreting what actually happened and why. Bystander hesitation and crime in Cuba. In exploring why people sometimes fail to intervene when strangers behave suspiciously, Gladwell introduces the concept of bystander hesitation. He illustrates this through the case of pedophile Larry Nassar, who sexually abused hundreds of young gymnasts despite parents often being present in the examination room. When confronted with ambiguous behavior from a stranger, particularly someone in a position of authority, we tend to default to the least threatening interpretation. Parents watched Nassar perform medical procedures that made them uncomfortable, but they suppressed their concerns because they defaulted to trusting his professional credentials and reputation. This hesitation to challenge authority figures or question seemingly respectable strangers appears throughout human interaction. We worry about seeming rude, making false accusations, or creating uncomfortable social situations. This caution serves us well in most circumstances, but creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited. Gladwell contrasts this with the surveillance system in Cuban society, where everyone is encouraged to watch everyone else and report suspicious behavior. While this system effectively reduced certain types of crime, it created a society of mutual suspicion and surveillance that most would find intolerable. This comparison highlights a fundamental tension. The same trust that makes civil society function also creates blind spots that can be exploited. The alternative, constant suspicion and surveillance, might prevent some crimes but would destroy the social fabric that makes life worth living. The challenge is finding the balance between naive trust and paranoid suspicion when dealing with strangers. Gladwell suggests we need institutional safeguards that protect against the worst abuses without requiring everyone to become suspicious of everyone else. The holy fool. Gladwell concludes with the concept of the holy fool, someone who interacts with strangers in a radically different way than most people. The holy fool refuses to play by the conventional rules of deference, politeness, and assumption-making that characterize most stranger interactions. He returns to the Sandra Bland case, arguing that Officer Encinia was operating with a set of problematic assumptions about how strangers should behave during traffic stops. When Bland didn't show the expected deference and compliance, he interpreted her behavior as threatening rather than simply different. The holy fool represents an alternative approach, meeting strangers with transparency rather than assumption, with genuine curiosity rather than preconceived expectations. It means accepting that we don't know much about the strangers we encounter and being humble about our ability to interpret their behavior. Gladwell doesn't suggest this approach is easy or always practical. Social interactions require some level of assumption and pattern matching to function smoothly. But he argues we need to be far more aware of the limitations of our abilities to read strangers and much more humble about the judgments we make based on limited information. The book ends by returning to Sandra Bland. Gladwell suggests that her death represents a systemic failure in how we manage interactions between strangers, particularly across differences of race, gender, and power. Better training, different protocols, and greater awareness might have prevented the cascade of misunderstandings that led to her arrest and ultimately her death. The puzzle of human interaction. Throughout Talking to Strangers, Gladwell builds a complex picture of human interaction as a puzzle with many missing pieces. We navigate this puzzle with a set of tools that evolved for close-knit communities, but often fail us when applied to diverse, modern societies where we constantly encounter people from different backgrounds, cultures, and contexts. Our default to truth helps society function, but leaves us vulnerable to deception. Our belief in transparency leads to overconfidence in reading others' emotions and intentions. Our inability to recognize mismatched and coupled behaviors causes us to misinterpret actions based on our own expectations rather than others' realities. These aren't just academic concerns. As Gladwell demonstrates through cases ranging from spy detection to campus sexual assault to police interactions, these misunderstandings can have profound consequences. They shape our justice system, international relations, institutional policies, and personal safety. The book doesn't offer simple solutions, but invites readers to approach interactions with strangers with greater humility and awareness. It suggests we need better systems and institutions that account for the limitations of human judgment rather than relying on individual discernment alone. Perhaps most importantly, it challenges us to recognize the complexity behind seemingly simple interactions between people who don't know each other. The next time we judge a stranger's behavior as odd, threatening, or suspicious, we might pause to consider the many ways we might be misreading their intentions and actions. Misreading in historical context. Gladwell places our tendency to misread strangers in historical context, showing how it has shaped major events throughout human history. Beyond the examples already discussed, Chamberlain misreading Hitler, the CIA misinterpreting KSM's resistance, he examines how these patterns appear repeatedly in consequential interactions between strangers. The Cuban Missile Crisis, diplomatic negotiations, intelligence failures, judicial decisions, and police encounters all demonstrate how high the stakes can be when we misunderstand those we don't know. These aren't isolated incidents but manifestations of systematic problems in human social cognition. Historical patterns reveal that we haven't improved much at reading strangers despite technological advances. If anything, modern society creates more opportunities for misunderstanding as we regularly interact with people from diverse backgrounds, without the shared context that might help us interpret their behavior accurately. This historical perspective helps explain why certain professions, diplomacy, intelligence, law enforcement, have developed protocols and systems to compensate for individual limitations in reading strangers. These institutions recognize, at least implicitly, that human judgment alone is insufficient for high-stakes interactions with unknown others. Understanding this history might help us design better approaches to stranger interactions in the future. Rather than relying on the illusion that we can become better at reading individuals, we might create contexts and structures that account for our limitations and reduce the consequences of inevitable misunderstandings. Culture and misunderstanding. Cultural differences significantly amplify the potential for misreading strangers. Gladwell explores how norms around eye contact, emotional expression, deference to authority, and communication styles vary dramatically across cultural contexts. What constitutes normal, honest, or respectful behavior in one culture may be interpreted very differently in another. Direct eye contact might signal honesty in one context, but disrespect in another. Emotional restraint might indicate dignity in one culture but suspicious coldness in another. These cultural mismatches become particularly problematic in high-stakes situations like criminal justice proceedings, international negotiations, or immigration enforcement. When authority figures from one cultural background interact with individuals from another, the potential for misunderstanding multiplies. The Sandra Bland case exemplifies this dynamic. The interaction between Bland and Encinia wasn't just about personality or circumstance, but reflected broader cultural patterns around authority, race, and communication. Their different expectations about how the encounter should proceed created a spiral of misinterpretation with tragic consequences. Gladwell suggests that awareness of these cultural dimensions isn't enough. Systems and institutions need to be designed with the assumption that cross-cultural misunderstandings will occur, rather than expecting individuals to overcome these challenges through personal skill or cultural sensitivity alone. Truth, lies, and social functioning. Woven throughout the book is a deep exploration of how truth and deception function in social systems. Gladwell challenges simplistic notions about honesty and lying, showing how our social fabric depends on complex patterns of trust, doubt, transparency, and opacity. Our default to truth isn't a bug, but a feature of human social cognition. Society couldn't function if we approached every interaction with suspicion. This default position serves us well in the overwhelming majority of situations where people are being basically honest. The problem arises with disadvantaged strangers, those who don't fit our expectations or whose behavior doesn't match our preconceptions. We're particularly prone to misreading people who are different from us, whether through culture, social position, neurological difference, or circumstance. Gladwell examines how justice systems attempt to determine truth through adversarial processes, how intelligence agencies try to distinguish between genuine and deceptive information, and how ordinary people navigate truth and deception in daily life. In all these domains, he finds patterns of systematic error that emerge from our fundamental approach to strangers. Rather than suggesting we become more suspicious, Gladwell argues for greater awareness of our limitations. The book advocates for transparent systems that acknowledge these limitations, rather than pretending we can overcome them through individual skill or effort. The complexity of consent. One of the most challenging applications of Gladwell's framework involves sexual consent between strangers, particularly in the context of alcohol and campus culture. He examines several controversial cases where differing interpretations of consent led to accusations of sexual assault. These cases highlight the perfect storm of factors that make stranger interactions prone to catastrophic misunderstanding. Alcohol-induced myopia, cultural differences in communication, mismatched behaviors, and the coupling of behavior to specific environments. Gladwell doesn't dismiss the seriousness of sexual assault or deny the reality of consent violations. Instead, he suggests that our approach to these issues often fails to account for the complexity of human interaction, particularly between intoxicated strangers who may genuinely perceive the same situation differently. This perspective invites us to think about prevention differently. Rather than focusing exclusively on individual education about consent, though this remains important, we might examine the environments and contexts that enable misunderstanding. Addressing the coupling between alcohol, unsupervised spaces, and sexual activity might prove more effective than assuming clear communication can always prevail. This nuanced approach has drawn both praise and criticism. Some worry it diminishes accountability, while others find it a more realistic basis for effective prevention. Regardless of one's position, Gladwell's framework highlights the extraordinary complexity of consent determination in interactions between strangers whose perceptions and interpretations may fundamentally differ. Authority and deference. The dynamics of authority significantly shape interactions between strangers, creating additional opportunities for misunderstanding. Gladwell examines how power differentials affect our ability to read others accurately and their willingness to express themselves honestly. In interactions with authority figures, police officers, doctors, teachers, employers, people often default to behaviors they believe are expected rather than expressing their true thoughts or feelings. This deference creates a facade that authority figures may mistake for genuine emotional states or intentions. Conversely, those in authority often misinterpret noncompliance or questioning as hostility or deception, rather than legitimate confusion, cultural difference, or principled disagreement. This pattern appears repeatedly in police encounters, where officers may escalate situations based on perceived disrespect rather than actual threat. The Sandra Bland case exemplifies this dynamic. Officer Encinia interpreted Bland's questioning and reluctance as defiance requiring assertion of authority, rather than as legitimate confusion or principled resistance. This misreading transformed a routine traffic stop into a confrontation with fatal consequences. Gladwell suggests that authority figures need training that specifically addresses these dynamics, helping them distinguish between genuine threats and mere differences in communication style or cultural expectations. Systems of authority need built-in safeguards that prevent misunderstandings from escalating unnecessarily. The role of technology. Gladwell explores how technology affects our interactions with strangers, sometimes exacerbating misunderstandings and sometimes providing safeguards against them. Police body cameras and dashboard cameras provide objective records of encounters that might otherwise be subject to conflicting interpretations. The Sandra Bland case became a matter of public discussion precisely because the interaction was recorded. Without that record, the details of what transpired might have remained disputed or unknown. However, technology also creates new opportunities for misunderstanding. Online interactions strip away many of the contextual cues we rely on to interpret others' intentions and emotions. Social media platforms encourage quick judgments about strangers based on limited information, often leading to misinterpretation and conflict. Artificial intelligence systems designed to detect deception or predict behavior often encode and amplify existing biases in how we read strangers. These systems may claim objectivity while reflecting the same flawed assumptions that lead humans astray. Gladwell suggests we need technology designed with awareness of human limitations rather than technology that pretends to overcome them. Systems that provide context, slow down judgment, and create space for clarification might help us navigate stranger interactions more successfully. Beyond individual solutions. Throughout Talking to Strangers, Gladwell argues against purely individual solutions to the problems he identifies. These challenges aren't simply matters of personal skill or moral character, but reflect fundamental limitations in human social cognition. Rather than suggesting we can become better at reading strangers through practice or education, he advocates for systems and structures that account for these limitations. These might include institutional protocols that reduce reliance on subjective interpretation, environmental designs that minimize contexts where misunderstandings have serious consequences, training that emphasizes awareness of limitations rather than confidence in personal judgment, cultural shifts that value humility and caution in assessing strangers, technology that provides additional context rather than replacing human judgment. This systems-oriented approach represents a significant departure from common narratives about improving cross-cultural communication, or developing better people-reading skills. Gladwell suggests these individual approaches are insufficient given the depth and persistence of our tendency to misread strangers. Conclusion: toward better understanding. Talking to strangers doesn't offer simple solutions to the challenges it identifies. There's no checklist for accurately reading strangers or foolproof method for avoiding misunderstanding. Instead, Gladwell invites readers to approach interactions with strangers with greater humility, awareness, and caution. The book argues for acceptance of inherent limitations in our ability to interpret others' behavior and intentions. This acceptance isn't defeatist but realistic, a necessary step toward developing better approaches to stranger interactions. By recognizing how often and how systematically we misunderstand those we don't know, we might become less confident in our snap judgments, more willing to consider alternative interpretations, and more careful about the consequences of acting on limited information. This perspective has profound implications for how we design social systems, from criminal justice to national security to campus policies. If misreading strangers is inevitable, then systems should be designed with this limitation in mind, rather than pretending it can be overcome through individual skill or effort. Perhaps most importantly, Gladwell's work invites us to approach encounters with strangers with genuine curiosity rather than assumption. Instead of believing we can quickly understand others based on limited information, we might recognize the vast complexity behind every human interaction and the humility required to navigate it successfully. In a world where globalization, technology, and social change constantly bring us into contact with strangers from different backgrounds and contexts, this message has never been more important. Our ability to interact successfully with those we don't know may determine our collective future. If you found this exploration of how we misread strangers valuable, please support our channel by liking this video, subscribing for more in-depth book summaries, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. What's your experience with misreading strangers? Have you encountered situations where defaulting to truth led you astray, or where you misinterpreted someone's behavior because it didn't match your expectations? Join the conversation and continue exploring these fascinating aspects of human interaction. Remember, you can purchase Malcolm Gladwell's complete work through the link in the description below. Until next time, may you approach the strangers in your life with both openness and awareness.